That was wonderful. Thank you. I can tell today's going to be a good day. The sun is shining. We've sung Beatles songs. The groundhog didn't see his shadow. It's all good. That comes from the words of Pete the Cat. All right, so our scripture this morning, I want to go ahead and read it first and then work our way through it. And as Scott set it up, it is a passage that deals with help. It comes from the Gospel of Mark, which we're working our way through. It's about Jairus and his daughter and the hemorrhaging woman. We're going to read through it once and then go back through it and kind of discern what it's talking about. So I invite you to hear this passage now as if you're listening to the story for the first time. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. And then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet. And he begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble this teacher any farther?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping." They laughed at him, and he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in there where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years old. At this, they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly ordered them, here's that messianic secret from Mark again, he strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. So that's our passage from this morning from the Gospel of Mark, and as a way to kind of delve into it, I want to share with you a story. Happened a couple of years ago. I was at a conference, a retreat for clergy in mid-career stage. Now, I was surprised that I was invited to the mid-career clergy thing, but anyway, I've done it for a while now, and I guess they figured at 15 years you're good enough to come. So there's this leader there, and her name is Dawn. Dawn's very engaging, very dynamic, has a wonderful story of her own. She grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, always felt a call to ministry, was told that women couldn't be preachers, so she joined the Disciples of Christ. But now, years later, she has a baby that's born. The baby now is a senior in high school and doing very well, so it's a good story. But as a baby, her child had what was, quote, a failure to thrive. And so they were going to the pediatrician every day, trying to do all that they could. The baby, her daughter, wasn't gaining weight. And at one point, Dawn said to the group gathered here, because we've been trading stories about our children and everything that takes place with ministry in the church, Dawn said to this group, and I'll always remember this, she said, "At some point, I had to give it all up to Jesus. And I said, I'm doing all that I can, God, but I know that this child ultimately belongs to you." Now, when I heard her say that, I thought, man, what does she mean by that? Those words, everything, even my child, ultimately belongs to you, were for me and still are both very freeing and very troubling. Because how do you trust God so completely that even if your child doesn't get well, you still believe in God with that complete and total trust? So in the scripture this morning, with those thoughts in mind, Jairus goes to the synagogue. Now, Jairus would have been a leader of the synagogue himself. He had all of the credentials, all of the training. He probably had the Hebrew scriptures memorized word for word and could recite them. But his daughter is ill, and he's desperate for help. He will do anything to have her healed, and any parent knows this feeling. So he goes to this man who is new in town named Jesus. For Jairus and the people of the faith community then, we know the story of Jesus and the healings. It would not have been as familiar to Jairus. So he goes to Jesus, this itinerant rabbi, the rabbi who does not have a home or a place to lay his head, the rabbi who has none of the proper credentialing or preaching or pedagogy skills or anything like that. He goes to this man and he says to Jesus, "Can you heal my daughter?" Okay, so that's story number 2. We've got a couple stories here today. We got Dawn's story about giving her daughter over to God no matter what happened. We have the story of Jairus, and then there's 2 more stories. Story number 3. I didn't read it because it's a long passage, but bookending today's story. So in between these 2 stories is also another story of healing. So Jesus tells Jairus that he is willing to go to his house and to heal his daughter. On his way to the house of Jairus, a woman stops him who has been hemorrhaging, bleeding for 12 years. And without any invitation at all, this woman reaches out and grabs the robe of Jesus or the clothes of Jesus and is instantly made well, it says, Mark says. So it's a healing story. And the placement of these 2 stories are not by chance. They're very intentionally thought out. So Jairus' daughter, we know, was 12 years old. The woman had been bleeding for 12 years. Jairus' daughter in that time would not have been considered high or visible on the cultural ladder, so neither would have the woman who was hemorrhaging. She would have been on the outskirts of society. So Mark is saying Jesus pays the most attention, perhaps, to those who are the least visible. And Jesus also heals. That's all of the most obvious points. But here's what is not as clear to me and what troubles me and what I want us to think about this morning. What do the healings actually mean? What does it mean when we ask God to be healed? What does it mean when we hear about these miracles or see these miracles? And what does it mean when miracles and prayers are not answered in the ways that we want them to be? You know, despite all of the advances in technology, all of the prayers, people still die, right? Death is the great equalizer at all. And what do we do when those prayers for healing aren't answered? Or put another way, how can we read about a miracle in the Bible and not say, I want that miracle myself? So, Frederick Buechner, story number 4, well-known pastor and theologian. He had a daughter who was battling anorexia. She'd been in the hospital, and he writes in his memoir, "The only way I knew to be her father was to take care of her, to move heaven and earth to make her well. And of course, I couldn't do that. I didn't have either the wisdom or the power to make her well." So Frederick Buechner, like Dawn, turns it all over to God. Sometimes the best we can do, the most honest prayer we can say when we cry out to God in times that aren't making sense, is simply help. I just need someone to help. So after the woman is healed, Jesus makes his way back to the home of Jairus. And the story goes that some said he was too late and the people had already passed away. And the crowd says to Jesus, "She's dead." And Jesus says, "No, she's just sleeping." And that line, "she's just sleeping," leads to the 5th story I want to share today. So that's 5 stories. I don't know if you can keep them all straight or not, but that's all right. Story number 5 is this. As a young kid, I would go with my parents and my sister to church most Sundays, First Christian Church, St. Joseph, Missouri. The pastor I had growing up, his name was Charles Bear. Charles still is, a bit of a rabble-rouser. He liked to cause trouble, disturb emotions, say things that would get people to think. He fought for injustice. He was also a father. Now, think about this in your own life. If you grew up in a church, how many sermons can you remember? And don't tell me, I might take it personally. I wouldn't. But I was thinking, I can't remember too many sermons that Charles gave. I can remember the tone of his voice and the cadence of his preaching. Can't remember a lot of specific stories or lines. But in one sermon, I do remember, he talked about the death of his son. Now, his son was young and ambitious and full of life, and I didn't know Charles at this time. And one day, his son, who was also a pilot, decided to fly in an experimental ultralight plane. And the plane crashed. And so I remember Charles telling this story. And at some point, I can't remember if it's at the crash site or at the funeral, but someone says to Charles, "He's just sleeping." And Charles says, No, he's not. He's dead. I remember thinking as a kid, what deep thoughts to share so publicly. And so all of these thoughts are racing through my head this week for this sermon. And then there's the recent helicopter crash in California, right? And I'm not really a fan of professional basketball, but I knew who Kobe Bryant was. And I think about all those families that were also on the helicopter and impacted by that crash. And I can't even begin to imagine their horror and sadness. So then we come back to our scripture for today and we ask, where is the good news in this healing story? I mean, after all, Jairus' daughter was healed, and so was the woman who was hemorrhaging. But like I said earlier, the thing about miracles is we hear about one or we see one and we want one for ourselves too. So what's the good news? I think there's two possible answers, neither of which may be fully adequate, but the first is this. After hearing the initial reports that his daughter is dead, Jesus says to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." So this does not mean for us today, I got to be very clear about this. This does not mean that if we only believe more or pray more or hold God more deeply in our hearts, we'll have all of our prayers answered. It does not mean that. But what it does mean is that God's love, God's continual love, is the most powerful force in the world, more powerful than even death. And so if Jairus really believed this, and Mark says that he does, then even if his daughter had not been brought back to life, Jairus still would have trusted God. And to me, that's the real miracle of the story. Trusting God when your world falls apart. And that leads to answer number 2. With God, says Mark, with God, promises Jesus, you are never, ever alone. There is no earthly condition, no sickness, no debilitation, no alienation, no isolation, no depression, no self-imposed guilt, nothing that can prevent Jesus Christ from finding you and gathering you into his Spirit. The people of the Bible have always understood this. In Psalm 139, the psalmist asks to God, "Where can I go from your Spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol," that would have been hell, "you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for the darkness is a light to you. Here's the thing about miracles. They only last for a moment. They're just a brief ripple interruption in time and in space. But in that moment of suspension, in that moment of seeing something new, the Spirit of God breaks forth in ways that we may never understand or have even dreamed of before, and perhaps most assuredly not in the way that we prayed. But when these miracles happen, and if you look around and pay attention, I promise they happen all the time, you can know that that is God's Spirit speaking to you, and that nothing will ever separate you from God's love. And that is the miracle and the mystery of the story. Through Christ we say together, amen.